This is Land of Havilah, Psalm 2. The theme of this psalm is that a large part of the world is antagonistic against God and His anointed, which is Christ. Always has been, always will be. The voice that's speaking in this psalm will switch back and forth without warning between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We'll read all 12 verses and comment. Verse 1. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth take a stand, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against His anointed, saying, Let's break their bonds apart and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens will laugh. The Lord will have them in derision. Then He'll speak to them in His anger and terrify them in His wrath. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I will tell of the decree. Yahweh said to me, You are my son, today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I'll give the nations for your inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore be wise, you kings, be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve Yahweh with fear and rejoice with trembling. Give sincere homage to the Son, lest He be angry, and you perish on the way, for His wrath will soon be kindled. Blessed are all those who take refuge in Him. Comment. In our human viewpoint, we don't generally look out on the world and figure it's violently antagonistic toward God. But it is, at least at times. When it comes right down to it, most of the world isn't in line with God, and when push comes to shove, they'll violently oppose Him. Jesus didn't say most people were with Him. He knew for a fact that when it came right down to it, most people would listen to the authorities and abandon Him, which they did at the cross. All it took was a few evil rulers, and the people listened to them because they weren't fully committed to God. Therefore, they killed Jesus. So let's not think the world will stick with God in good times and bad. The world absolutely will not. In verses 1 and 2, the people of the earth and their rulers are against God and His anointed, which is Christ. How does that antagonism play out? They rage, plot, scheme, take a stand, and conspire together against God and His anointed. Partially it's a prophecy that the people of Jesus' time and their rulers would oppose Him and kill Him, which they did approximately 1,000 years after this psalm was written. They raged against Christ, and in so doing they were raging against God the Father. This interpretation isn't guesswork. That's exactly the interpretation of it as confirmed in Acts 4:23-31. However, it's more than a prophecy of what Jesus' generation would do to Him. It's a statement that all generations of the past have opposed God to a greater or lesser degree, and the generations of the future will always oppose Him as well, culminating in their rage against Him and against His people in the Great Tribulation. So it's a specific prophecy about Jesus' generation, and it also applies to the coming generation of the Great Tribulation, but it's also a general rule for all generations, past, present, and future. They oppose God. In verse 2, let's break their bonds apart and cast their cords from us, end quote. Speaking of the bonds and cords that God puts on them for restraint. The people of the earth feel like God restrains them, and He does because He restrains evil. 2 Thessalonians 2:6 and 7. The people of the earth want to throw off those restraining bonds and cords and do evil freely, and they think they can without consequence. But in verses 4 and 5, He who sits in the heavens laughs. He'll speak to them in anger and terrify them in His wrath. There'll be a judgment, in other words, which is why it was a vain idea to rebel against Him in the first place. They won't get away with it. In verse 6, we come to another equally correct interpretation of the psalm, that it described opposition to King David and how God would smash all his enemies. David was God's anointed to be king, that is. God said in verse 6, Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. Zion was a hill in Jerusalem where King David had his home and fortress, but it's also the place from which Christ will rule in the millennium. So this is a double reference to David and how he ruled with iron authority from Zion, and Christ and how He'll rule with iron authority from the same place. Over and over in the Psalms, we see the same pattern that the prophecies apply to David and to the Christ. In verses 7 and 8, the Father says to the Son, You are my Son, today I have become your Father. Ask of me, and I'll give you the nations for your inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession." End quote. That was God the Father granting the Son the entire earth. And by the way, the Son has authority in heaven as well. Jesus said, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth," Matthew 28:18. In the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, after Jesus finished his mission on earth, the Father received him back to heaven and gave him, quote, "dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed." In other words, the Father gave Christ dominion over the earth forever. Therefore, any attempts to oppose him will come to nothing. Such attempts are laughable. Heaven holds them in derision. In verse 9, the Father says to the Son, "You shall break them with a rod of iron." In other words, when Jesus returns to the earth in his glory, to sit on the throne of his glorious kingdom, Matthew 25:31, he won't be a weak king after tolerating insults against him and against his followers millennium after millennium. He'll be done with it. He'll take control of all the kingdoms of the earth with a rod or scepter of iron. There'll be iron rule. Nothing's as bad as an evil dictator, and nothing's as good as a totally benevolent and powerful dictator like Christ. In the three final verses, verses 10 to 12, there's only one intelligent response to all this. Now's the time to get on the right side of history. There's no sense in opposing God. It'll end poorly. In verse 11, "Serve him with fear and rejoice with trembling." That's a funny thing, to rejoice with trembling. How is it that we rejoice but tremble at the same time? We rejoice knowing that God's for us, and we tremble at the thought of opposing him. In verse 12, "Give sincere homage to the Son," meaning to the Son of God, "lest he be angry, for his wrath will soon be kindled." God's patient, but there'll come a time when patience is no longer appropriate. He'll judge in anger and wrath. If he didn't, he wouldn't be righteous. And the capping statement at the end of verse 12, "Blessed are all those who take refuge in him," end quote, meaning blessed are those who take refuge in the Son. Now's the time. We're being recruited for the winning team as we speak. Jesus said, "Come to me," 8 times in the Gospels, John 7:37 and other places. How many invitations do we want? Let's come to him. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. Psalm 3 is next.